I wish everybody looked at their caregivers as their greatest asset. How can they actually pay, show, appreciate, and make that person feel like they wouldn't have a business if they weren't there? And not use them as an employee to do a job, but as their greatest asset.
You're listening to Home Care Hindsight, the podcast where we talk with home care leaders about the big mistakes they've made and the even bigger lessons they've learned along the way. I'm David Knack, head of sales here at Zengage, and I've built a career on the idea that we learn a whole lot more from our mistakes than from our successes, which is great because I've made a lot of mistakes. I've gotten to know some of the leaders in this industry who've built amazing businesses and are super well respected. So I thought it'd be fun, instead of asking them about the great things they've accomplished, to have them tell the story of one of the biggest mistakes that they've made and how that mistake changed their thinking and the way they run their business. All right, welcome back to another episode of Home Care Hindsight, put on by Zengage, the leading caregiver engagement platform. I'm joined today by Greg Bean from Paradigm Senior Services. Greg, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Greg, for people who aren't familiar with you, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, I am the Vice President of Paradigm Senior Services. I have been working here in our industry for about 30 years in the home care space.
Every time you and I talk, I learn not just like why stuff is the way it is today, but kind of like the history of how we got here. And so you've been in this industry for a long time. We'll probably get into some of this in the show, but like, what are, I don't know, the two or three biggest changes that you've seen over, let's call it, the last 10 years in the business?
Over the last 10 years, we've seen a drastic shift from individuals understanding just private pay versus usage of third-party payers in our industry, whether it be Medicaid, the VA, Medicare Advantage programs, and other things. We've seen a much bigger shift away from just the private pay industry in the home care space to using multiple different payer sources. And a lot of that's been affected by just economy and economic shift across the country. 10 years ago, when your mom needed home care, she started home care. She worked in this space. You kept her on service with a home care company till forever, actually.
Yeah.
And now we see that same person not having the funding resources, and so on to manage that client for a 10-year period. It's a much shorter section of time.
Mm-hmm. So length of stay, especially in private pay, has gotten a lot shorter.
I think on a national average, we see the length of stay for a home care client to be as low as 8 months. So we see a much bigger transition. It's a much more transient population in the home care space than what it used to be, which is allowing us to need some of these other sources to assist us. And not only that, just financially to assist us in providing care to a horribly underserved population.
Yeah. One of the things that I've had people on this show and that they've talked about is, we always said we'd never work with the government, whether that's the VA or Medicaid or whatever. And some changes from I think, broader economic perspective on the private pay side has changed their tune a little bit there. But also, I mean, it sounds to me like, and you know a lot better than I do, that Medicaid has become a much better partner to work with.
Well, Medicaid is kind of split into three significant pieces in our space in long-term supportive services. So you have long-term supportive services into facility, which is your nursing home, paid under Medicaid, things along that line. You have the adult space, which is your waiver programs and adults getting care and hourly service. And then you have the pediatric piece. Within that adult space in the United States, it's approximately $1 trillion business. And you look at the different states and the receiving numbers of Medicaid. I mean, you go to California, there's 13 million recipients. You go to Texas, there's 9. I mean, you start looking at some of these states and the opportunity within the Medicaid space. It's a massive population base, and it's funded both federally as well as by state funds.
Yeah. Well, I always do this segment on the show where I ask, what kind of person are you? Because it's what I just want to ask in every conversation, but I can't because it's not how generally talking to people works. And so on my podcast, I'm allowed to. And so to ask you that question, I want to ask, if you could go back in time and choose a different career path, what would it be?
I don't think I would choose a path other than being a nurse. I think being a nurse is one of the most rewarding professions and one of the most rewarding things that a person could ever do. Would I have moved to the administrative side and do what I do today versus working as a bedside nurse or in a unit or on a hospital or working in that environment? I don't know that I would, but I would have to tell you that I don't think I could think of a more rewarding profession than that of being a nurse.
Yeah. Well, there's a shortage, so I think they'd take you right now if you wanted to get back in the game. So I bring people on the show who are well-known, well-respected, have had careers where they've accomplished a lot, and we don't talk about any of that stuff. Instead, we talk about a big mistake that they've made in their career and all the stuff that they've learned from it. And so, Greg, what's your big mistake?
I always jokingly say that my biggest mistake was opening my first home care company. because I didn't realize how hard of work that would be. It's one of the most challenging, difficult professions on the planet because you think it's going to be this, I'm going to jump in, I'm going to help an underserved population, I'm going to help people in their home, it's going to be amazing. And you don't realize that, oh my gosh, I'm going to work 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. So with that being said, I wouldn't change it. I think it's one of the most rewarding professions. It's one of the most rewarding opportunities. If people jump into this profession saying, oh, I jumped in to become a millionaire, they went down the wrong path. What they jump into is to be a servant to people and really serve humans in a very vulnerable space, which allows us to do that and still be profitable if we do our businesses correctly.
Yeah. Tell me when did you start your home care agency? What was that? What led to that happening? What was that journey like for you?
Yeah, so I was a friend of mine who said, "Hey, let's take this journey. Let's jump in. Had a little bit of extra money. Let's run down this path." It was 30 years ago this year, so you
Sure.
think back of, and I was working in an acute care setting and then moving over to a non-acute care setting, and I don't think that you could ever go back and say, was this a bad move? I think it was an amazing move because it took me down the path of home care and has put me there for the last 30 years, which is something that I just absolutely love and enjoy. But it was a very difficult transition from acute to a non-acute setting because you didn't realize how many underserved people there were, but then how hard the work was going to be in accomplishing that day to day.
Yeah. What do you think are the things that are still the same today that were challenges 30 years ago when you started your business that have remained challenges today?
Family members, no.
It sounds like it.
I say that with a little bit of tongue in cheek, but the reality is that many times family members have an expectation of what's going to be done for the client and what's going to be done on a day-to-day basis, and they want you to come in on a very limited scale, but provide the care that would be provided if someone was there 24 hours a day. And so they think that happens. Many times the clients are incredibly happy with the care, the services being provided, but family members have a much bigger or a different expectation of care and services to be provided. So with that being said, with the limited resources available, but the needs of clients, I would still say that's probably the biggest challenge in our industry.
Yeah, it's just that navigation of multiple stakeholders in the decision-making process. You've got the client who is most immediately impacted by the kind of care they're receiving. You've, of course, got a caregiver that you've got to keep happy and have a schedule that makes sense for them. And then you add this additional layer of complexity of sometimes one family member who has expectations, realistic or not, but other times, 2 or 3 different cooks in the kitchen from the family member perspective. And so, when you talk to agency owners, when you were an agency owner yourself, how did you navigate those kinds of demands? And what was the kind of conversations that you had to get family members on board with and have appropriate expectations of what home care was going to be given their resources?
Sometimes it's very difficult to have that really challenging or courageous conversation, as you might call it, to really lay out what the expectations are from the family, as well as what the opportunities are from the home care company. What can I provide for service to your loved one, whether it be your husband, your wife, daughter, son, whatever, whoever's receiving that care? How can I set an expectation for the level of care that's going to be provided and the opportunity that's there from the very first conversation? Yeah. And I think the real point to that then is then holding myself accountable to meeting those goals and expectations of the client that you've set forward. So setting it up in the first place, but then meeting that expectation. makes it incredibly easy to deal with the family
Yeah.
as well as the client. Because if you tell them that your caregiver is going to show up at 7 o'clock every morning and work from 7 to 11, and these are tasks that are going to be accomplished, but your caregiver shows up at 7:15 and 7:30 and 8 o'clock, and then they're not, and then they go in and that something isn't cleaned or meals aren't prepared. If you're not meeting the expectation that you've set for both yourself, the family, and the client, and your caregivers, then you're failing the client, and it becomes a very challenging situation. But if your caregiver shows up every day at 7 o'clock and they prepare every meal and they go in and the house is clean and the things that are being, the needs of the client are being met to the expectation you set up in the first place, it's incredibly easy to deal with family members and clients because you've done what you were told from the very beginning you were going to accomplish.
Yeah. And this is like such a foundational question for how to run a home care agency. But I know you've probably had thousands of conversations with home care owners in the last 30 years. And so in terms of, let's imagine we've set those expectations appropriately and everybody's bought in, like, how do you meet those expectations?
Well, I think hiring and understanding caregiver expectations, caregivers come to work for us for three reasons: because we have work, because we pay them, and because we're nice. And we set an expectation of service and care when we bring someone on board to that level. But if I'm always nice we so frequently don't show the nice part back to caregivers, whether it be through supporting them on the back end with a simple thank you.
Yeah.
Or making sure that they show up on time and giving them the resources they need to accomplish that, and then rewarding them for their successes. I think rewarding people for success is so vitally important. But when caregivers feel appreciated and they're rewarded for their successes, they show up on time, and if you educate them and you train them, then they perform the skill sets that you're looking for and what your needs to be met are. Our caregivers today don't leave to go to work at box stores or McDonald's. They go to work at other agencies that give them that support, they give them that back-end recognition, and they pay them and they have work for them. It's actually not as difficult as it might sound.
Yeah.
If you're providing those resources to your caregivers, then you've set them up for success with their clients as well.
Yeah. I think my initial reaction to that is nice doesn't scale. We have work for you can scale. We've got more clients, we've got more work. Pay can scale, right? We're getting paid for that work. We're divvying that out. But nice is the thing that I think is a real differentiator as it relates to caregivers. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, I would reach out to my caregivers from time to time just as a just kind of maintenance touch, just to check in. Hey, how's it going? Really appreciate your work. And their response to me would be, what do you need? And that tells me that they're only expecting to hear from us when there's a problem. And, that kind of proactive water cooler kinds of conversations that are just really hard to do at scale in home care are something that, as we've talked about the work we're doing at Zengage, is a big part of the reason that we exist, is because scaling culture in home care beyond 10 or 20 caregivers gets to be really difficult. People end up spending too much time in spreadsheets, too much time manually reaching out to caregivers in ways that aren't efficient and that are typically solving problems and putting out fires. And so that third point, being nice, can, I think, sound a little fluffy and a little trivial, but I agree with you. It's super, super important to caregiver loyalty and retention.
Well, I've actually had home care owners tell me that they're the best payer in the area, and they pay and they pay and they pay and they pay, and they still have turnover. But how many times has that same person sent a handwritten note and said, thank you, you came through for me?
Yeah.
Or sent them something as a support on the back end. And it's not a dollar. It's not always the money that's affecting them. Mind you, all of our caregivers work for money.
Yeah.
We all work for money. If
Yep.
we're not being paid, we're looking for a job that pays us money. Let's be clear. But the reality is that human support, that human acknowledgement of what a job well done is immeasurable. But when you see retention and you see people with retention, they have those things in place.
Yeah. And you can't make up for paying 10% less than the market rate with a lot of nice. But if you're at market rate and you're doing those kinds of things, we've seen people have pretty unbelievable impact on their retention by implementing standard, operationalized, automated ways to make sure that they're aware of who the top performers are in their agency and that those people are hearing thank you.
I 100% agree.
That's something that is missing in this space so often, is the ability to say thank you to the people who are out of sight, out of mind because they're reliable, because you don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to show up at work.
Absolutely agree.
All right, let's move to something that you see in the business that's totally underrated, that's often overlooked by agency owners. What's something that's underrated?
I think we kind of touched on it at the start of our program, but I would have to say the most underrated piece of what's going on in the home care space is third-party payers.
Yeah.
I would use the VA as an example. With 17 million veterans in this country, we're serving 173,000 in the home care space. Yeah.
Quick math. Is that 1% market penetration?
1% of the people that are being provided. With Medicaid being a massively underserved population, with Medicare Advantage. And one of the problems that we have as home care owners, and this is just an opinion, obviously, but I think it resonates with people that are looking outside the box, per se. In the past, we've always said, gross margin, gross margin, gross margin. If my gross margin isn't 50%, I'm not going to be profitable. If it's not this percentage, I'm not going to be profitable. But what is my gross profit? And when we start breaking this down and we start saying, okay, well, Medicaid, I would use a story of a client in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago. I was doing a presentation and I was working with a group from across the state. And one of the individuals that did private pay does about 500 hours a week of private pay, and they're very successful, and so on and so forth. One of the other individuals that was there does a huge Medicaid population base to the tune of about 6,000 hours a week. And the person that does 500 was actually almost ridiculing the other individual in this group about how they don't see how they can operate on 30% margin, and they would never do this business, and they think it's a horrible business practice, and so on and so forth. And the individual looked at him and he used his name and he said, you realize that I would rather have my 6,000 hours at 35% margin than your 500 hours at 50% margin when you start looking at true profitability. So understanding that profitability is not necessarily gross margin, and understanding diversification, a thought would be, if my VA client longevity is 4 to 5 years in a life cycle of a client, but my private pay client is going to have an 8-month longevity or life cycle, which one is going to support me for a longer period of time? Which now we start talking about stability and clients and having hours for our caregivers and retention, and one leads to the next to the next. So as we look to diversify and think about, is it mandatory or required for me to diversify? There's no law, there's no rule that says you have to. But if you want to be solvent in this industry today, I think diversification is paramount in growing your business.
Yeah. Sounds like, just to drill in a little bit on something else that's underrated here, is there's maybe a little too much attention paid to the profit margins from a unit economics perspective. My 1 hour of care nets me X number of dollars versus gross profit, which is the total amount of money that you make regardless of profit margin, as well as this idea of like the lifetime value of a client. So the VA, even though it's maybe 20 hours a week instead of a larger caseload, that's going to be a 20-hour a week client that you have for 5 years versus somebody who may need 35 hours a week but is only with you for 8 months.
That's correct. So when you're using resources to spend, to market, to grow, to be out in the community, so you have to factor in, what does it cost me per client to bring them on board? And if I have to have 2 clients to every one, and in reality that client's good for 4 years, I might have to have 8 clients to one from an onboarding perspective and resources and so on and so forth. So 1 client over the longevity of that client equals 8 on the other side. So when you start looking at cost and burden and administrative burden, you have to weigh those things out and put them into perspective to, yes, your margin might be better by 10% per hour per client, but in the longevity of that client, one might be much more profitable in the long term.
Yeah. I think the obvious question that I have from there is the way the administrative team looks in a third-party payer context might be a little bit different than the way the administrative looks in the strictly private pay environment. And so what kinds of things are you seeing people do in order to be more efficient and leaner from a back office perspective to be able to make the business make a lot of sense with leaning into third-party payers?
Yeah, so I think one of the big challenges is there's a lot of administrative burden with third-party payers on the back end.
Yeah.
So understanding that, utilization of a third party to actually manage and do oversight and run through those billing cycles
Yep.
and matching up and doing that, eliminating that administrative burden can be incredibly efficient.
Yep.
And it can save a huge amount of time, cost, and make your life much simpler as you go through. And of course, I would throw a plug in. I mean, that's what Paradigm does
Right.
for agencies, is to help to automate all those processes and eliminate that administrative burden from a billing and a revenue cycle, which then makes this a much more streamlined process for them long term.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And you guys are super well respected in the industry. You take care of a giant headache in a lot of business owners' lives, which is billing and handling denials and all the kind of stuff that goes into working with third-party payers that nobody kind of wants to think about. It feels a little bit like when people are thinking about like their taxes and stuff. It's like, I just want somebody else to take care of that because it's just a totally draining headache that I don't want to bother with.
Yeah, and again, can I do that in a way in which maintains my profitability, streamlines processes, allows us to eliminate the burden, but also expand my business? Because if I'm not having to, as an owner, if I'm not having to run around and managing all of those back end pieces, can I be outgrowing my business? So
Yep.
the old adage, I'm working on my business rather than in my business, becomes a true statement of fact.
Yep.
So, I can't tell you how many. So we work with over 3,000 owners. So I cannot tell you how many owners I've spoken to in the past, 30 years of doing this business that have told me, I don't have time to go market. I don't have time to grow my business. Every day I'm putting in my billing, I'm filling shifts, I'm running around, I'm chasing the back end opportunity or the administrative piece of my business every day. So I don't have time to grow. So if I can eliminate that burden and I can place that burden onto someone else to do, that allows me to free up my time and really do what I want to do, which is serve the public. I can be out doing community events. I can be doing social events. I can be doing things to really be what I wanted to be, which was a servant to this population base rather than a manager of a billing or revenue cycle.
Yeah. We talked about a big mistake that you made, which was getting into home care in the first place. Oops. But let's talk about a little mistake that you see home care owners make all the time, that if they quit, it'd make their lives or their businesses like 10 times better.
I think that what home care owners do over and over and over again that I see is they look at what they're paying and what they're doing in processing their employee revenue. And let me use an example. So I was in South Carolina and doing a presentation to a group of owners earlier this year. And across the board, I asked them, what are you paying your caregivers? What's your hourly rate of pay to your caregivers? And I heard $12 an hour. I heard $12.50 an hour. I heard 11, and I heard $10.50. Then we pulled up last year's Activated Insight / Home Care Pulse / and it said the surveyed caregivers, what's the minimum amount of money you will work for? It was $13.50. So even though they might be saying, I'm paying the same amount as everybody else in my area, and I'm equal to what everybody else is looking at, am I looking to what the people are telling them? If a caregiver says the minimal I'll work for is $13.50 and you're paying $12.50 or $13 or even $13.50 from that perspective, if that's the minimum, they're always looking for something better. So listen to what your caregivers are telling you and listen to what the industry is telling you. I worked with an owner in Pittsburgh last year who was placing all of his ads onto the internet. And when he looked at it, his ads he was like 26th in where he was paying. He goes, but I'm at the top 80% of the scale. I'm like, well, that means 20% of the people are paying better than you. So what are the people telling you? If that's where the people are recruiting and that's where they're drawing, I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is this is what the industry pays, but what will your employees work for? Take a moment back to figure out what your employees are actually looking for, and then what are the opportunities within that?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think there's this challenge of, we know that caregiver wages are going to increase. People are going to continue to need more money. We also know that our bill rates, especially if we're in a private pay context, are somewhat capped because, at some point, and we're already finding, I've talked to a couple of people who have said, we're getting called when somebody's private in-home caregiver is on vacation and they need somebody to fill in the gaps. And so we know that means that there's some serious price compression at the top end of the market. We can't go up anymore, or it's going to push more people to go direct and hire privately and all that kind of thing. And so, I think figuring out how to make the business make sense when your bill rate is capped to a pretty significant extent, and you're going to have to continue to spend more on the caregiver wages. How do you make the business make sense in terms of continuing to grow and being efficient and making money, given that kind of economic constraint?
Well, I spoke to an owner on Monday, and we were talking about third-party payers and expansion and how to actually leverage some of those opportunities. And his exact words were, 3 years ago, my bill rates were $20 an hour for private pay. Mm-hmm. And I had 34 clients. Today, my bill rates to pay for my caregiver's wage are at $40 an hour, and I have 7. So I have to bill 40 to manage where I wanted to be financially with my caregiver group, but I've lost 70% of my business because my rates are at 40 versus $20 an hour, which they were just 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So understanding that, yes, you have to raise your rates to meet the caregiver's needs, but it's also squeezing mom and dad and daughter, son, whoever it might be, that's gone from $20 an hour of paying to 40. We're seeing, instead of 38 or 40 hours a week, they're getting 28 or 30 hours a week. So understanding that affects the finances of every single person around us when it comes to economy. Yes, we do have to manage that around caregivers' wages, but there has to be a happy medium in there in what we do. That's why we have to look at diversification to manage some of those opportunities.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Well, we've talked about a lot of stuff that's gone wrong, but I always like to end every episode talking about something that's happened lately in your business that you're really proud of. So what's going right for you lately?
So as I look at the expansion and the opportunities of third-party payers and what's going on within Paradigm, we're seeing a huge number of agencies signing up for, enrolling in Medicaid, enrolling in the VA. In fact, in many places across the VA space, the networks have become closed because so many providers are starting to diversify and looking at that as an opportunity. Within the Medicaid space, more and more people are enrolling or using this opportunity to grow their business. So I have seen a massive shift in the past 18 months not away from private pay, but to third-party payers to expand that platform. Even franchise networks that were opposed to third-party payers that actually pushed their agencies back towards private pay and wanted that to be the focal point of their industry are engaging and expanding into third-party payers and understanding everything from Medicare Advantage to workman's comp to long-term care to the VA to Medicaid, and understanding how these opportunities are helping them to grow. And we've seen a massive increase in these people, which is expanding and how many more people are receiving care, and the expansion of services to people that weren't necessarily able to get that care and support prior.
Yeah. We're going to take a quick detour here. I'm going to call this segment the Medicare Advantage Minute. It just occurred to me. I don't know anything about Medicare Advantage. I think probably a lot of people who are listening to this know roughly what Medicare Advantage is, but probably don't have intimate familiarity with the way that works with their business. So what is Medicare Advantage to home care? Should people do it? Why should people do it?
Yeah. So in the past, straight Medicare, had an 80-20, you paid 20% of all costs. It was you received Medicare, you're 65 years old, it became your primary insurance. And then about 5 years ago, Medicare Advantage came into play as a significant role in our industry. What is Medicare Advantage? It's a managed care plan that takes your Medicare money as a 65-year-old insurance person and moves it. It takes the money, puts it all under a platform, and makes it managed care. So many of those plans no longer have a copay. Many of them don't have an insurance payment because all of those pieces and parts of your Medicare get rolled under one managed system. Well, the key to that was CMS says if you're in a managed care network, you no longer have to have a skilled need to get a home care aid. So under straight Medicare, the only way you can get an aid is if you have a nurse or a physical therapist receiving care that come in to do a bath. CMS says they do not have to have that requirement any longer, so they can do what they call in-home supportive care, which helps to eliminate rehospitalizations, transition to home, and give them care and support in the home to help them not have better outcomes. So 946 plans across the United States right now and growing offer in-home supportive care as part of their managed platform. So typically it's based around post-hospitalization or post-procedure, and the client gets sometimes up to 160 hours a year of home health aid care. Now, from an agency standpoint, they're going, I'm going to go out and I'm going to open this client and I'm going to do all the paperwork and I'm going to go through the burden and I'm only going to have 160 hours of service to this client. But just because a person's on Medicare does not mean it's not like Medicaid where they have to have limited funds. You can have any amount of money and receive Medicare because it's based on your age and requirement of and enrollment. With Medicare Advantage, it's the same. So we've seen in markets such as I've seen in one of the markets in Houston where a client has converted over 50% of those Medicare Advantage clients to private pay annualized. I've seen a 4-hospital or a 4-home care group in Minnesota convert 67% of over 100 clients in the last year over to private pay clients. So it opens up the door for you as a home care company to expand and allow you to provide that service. So when you're talking to social workers, case managers, so on and so forth, it gives you an opportunity to say, look, I can provide that care too if you're discharging somebody that has this benefit with Humana. And they're coming home with care, which helps them from a marketing standpoint, but it also helps them with a community impact standpoint because now they're engaging and helping this person to transition home, potentially converting to private pay. But even if they're not, they're doing a community impact to it. You know as well as I do that if you get really amazing care by Susie, the most amazing caregiver in the whole wide world this week, that comes home and you had hip surgery and she helped you for the last 3 weeks and you couldn't have made this transition without her, you're going to tell your neighbor who's going to tell their neighbor who's going to tell their neighbor, and we could go whisper down the lane type of aspect to this. But the reality is one good deed could lead to 100 referrals.
Sure. Totally makes sense. And I think there's also this kind of power of the story of like, we were really stressed because we know not a lot of people do Medicare Advantage work. So we were really worried that we wouldn't be able to find anybody who would provide those services. And this agency did, and they were so great, and their caregiver was amazing. I think that there's a really great opportunity there for you to, become the hero in somebody's story. And, it's a unique opportunity. Sounds like what's your feel on the window of time before this becomes something everybody does?
I think it's much like Medicaid. It's much like the VA platform. I think managed care programs, as people see the fact that this is an opportunity for them to be supporting back into their community, it's not a silver bullet that runs out there and fixes your home care, lack of clients or whatever it might be. But it's just another one of the many variations that you can do to become the provider of all services in your community. As that grows, networks close. So I would tell anybody, if you're interested in these things, make sure you're enrolling, make sure you're being a part of, make sure you're growing in this opportunity because it will affect you long-term as we go forward.
Yeah. Greg, before we sign off today, what do you want to plug?
A little bit about Paradigm Senior Services. We help to automate all those billing and back office processes to allow for supporting your VA billing, your Medicaid billing, whether it be workman's comp, whether it be any third-party payers. we can integrate with your system. We can do your billing. We can post those payments back to you. We can streamline these processes. We can get you paid on time. We can help you with regulatory matters as to what's going on along the way, and just overall genuinely provide support to allow you to grow your business. And then our teams on the back end help you with marketing action plans and growth plans and how to actually integrate all these opportunities into your business to grow.
Great. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining the show. Always good to talk to you. We got to do it with microphones in front of our face this time.
Thank you so much for having me.
On behalf of the team here at Ava, thanks for listening to our show. We'll be back next week with another episode. So make sure you subscribe wherever you listen. If you have feedback on the show, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or send us an email to podcast@joinava.com. Thanks. And remember, the year may be 2024, but hindsight is always 2020.
Night.